Thank you for joining and thank you for being patient. Okay. Can we do just quick testing? David, Alex.
Testing, can you hear me?
Oh, wow. That's rough. Can you try again?
Was it like too loud or what's the issue?
There was a lot of distortion, but this is better.
Okay.
Testing. Can you hear me?
Yes. Um, David, there's also feedback coming from your end. So I'm not sure if there's something we can do to fix it. If not, we will run with it.
Yeah, let me find some headphones.
All right. Sounds good. Again, thank you everyone for joining. We are going to talk about Web5. What is it? What does it mean? I think everyone has a lot of questions. So I guess the way this Twitter Spaces will be structured, we'll try to have some structured conversation for the first 30 to 40 minutes, and then would love to have people from the audience jump in with their thoughts, comments, questions, and topics that you might want to discuss. But again, we'll be starting in 2 minutes. We're just waiting for people to trickle in and also testing our speakers' audio here. David, are you back?
Yeah, is this better?
Oh, yeah, so much better. All right. Okay. Fingers crossed we don't have any Twitter Spaces bugs or Twitter Spaces crashing on us. But again, welcome everyone. Today we are talking about Web5. Quick introduction. My name is Mansi. I am the VP of Strategy and Operations at Skynet Labs. If you're not familiar with Skynet Labs, we are a decentralized storage protocol, application hosting protocol, and we have a lot of exciting new updates coming up. So definitely follow along. Um, I think I just want to give a little bit of background on what Web5 and why this conversation, um, what's the impetus behind this conversation, and then we will jump in with our two speakers. But even before that, Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'm Alex. I work at the Saya Foundation, which is a nonprofit that maintains the Saya software, which is what Skynet's built on top of. And personally, I'm very interested in peer-to-peer software and user-controlled identity and data. Um, so I really like to experiment with decentralized data patterns and I like reading about projects like Gun, Ceramic, Fission, Pyrgos, and Blue Skies ADX. So this Web5 stuff that just came out is super interesting to me.
Thanks, Alex. Excited to hear your thoughts. Um, David, love quick intros.
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. I'm David Vork. I've been in the decentralized storage space for 8 years now, mostly working on Saya and recently Skynet. And of course, before that, I was involved in Bitcoin. I have a very harsh lens usually when it comes to centralization and decentralization. I tend to be pretty focused on weaknesses and points of trust, and so I think that's going to be part of the conversation today. But mostly, I'm an engineer at heart. I love tinkering around and I love new toys like this Web5 stuff.
New toys. I love that. Yeah, how you defined it. So, if again, quick background, if you're not familiar with Web5, essentially, couple months ago, I think we saw Square rebrand as Block, and Block is now a combination of five companies, Square being one of them. The other four are Cash App, Spiral, Tidal, and a company named TBD. TBD, it actually started the name as a meme, like to be decided, but they stuck with it, and now the company is called TBD. And so what we saw happen a couple of days ago was TBD launching something called as Web5. I'm assuming most of us here are familiar with Web3. And so it looks like Jack Dorsey and the team at TBD jumped from Web3 directly to Web5. And so this conversation is just us talking about what that means. What is the ethos behind Web5? What are they trying to build? How does existing infrastructure like Skynet fit into the conversation? What are our opinions on this potential new Web5 platform? And getting into the technical weeds of what is needed to really create a truly decentralized internet and a platform for developers to build web applications. With that context, Web5, as they've defined it, is consistent of three components. One is a decentralized identity component. The second is a decentralized storage component. And then the final one is just an application layer for developers to build applications using these primitives. And I would say none of these ideas, in a sense, like decentralized identity or storage, are novel. They've been around. Organizations like ours, Science, kind of, we've been building it since 2014. So, with that context and background, David, Alex, would love to hear just like your initial high level thoughts on what we saw come out as Web5.
Yeah, I guess I can go first. And my first thought actually just has to do with the name. At first it was like kind of weird. It's like super snarky, and kind of condescending towards the Web3 space. But at the same time, I did think that it is kind of nice to have a different name to talk about what like Skynet does and what other data protocols are focused on, because Web3 really has come to mean more like blockchainy stuff and smart contracts and finance. And while Skynet is it is a blockchain application, it's really focused on webby things. It's focused more on like Dropbox and YouTube and Twitter. And so my first thought was like, okay, we can just start calling ourselves Web5, or like we can compare ourselves, say that Web5 is a competitor, and kind of get a nice catchy name to distinguish ourselves from the rest of the space. So that was kind of my first thought, and then I don't know how much more into the weeds I want to go on this first pass. So I think I'll pass it off to Alex.
Yeah, sort of the same for me. I was both surprised and actually excited to see that Web5 was focused on user-controlled identity and data, and I think it's almost like a rebrand of peer-to-peer software or apps. A lot of the space is so focused on financial applications, blockchains, tokens, and having worked a lot on this data, user-controlled data aspect, it always felt like I couldn't quite describe um, applications that were more of these peer-to-peer applications that focus on that. So it's kind of cool to see them come out um, and first of all focus on it in general, but also give it some new branding as well.
Yeah, it sounds like in a way it's exciting that a large organization um, is now finally paying attention to kind of the core infrastructure that is needed to build these decentralized applications. But at the same time, there's just a lot of questions. Are they building things from ground up? What does it look like? What are the primitives that they're building on? And I definitely want us to dive into the technicals. But before that, there's this one just theme that Web5 narrative has been around is that it's going to be running on Bitcoin. What does that even mean, David? I'm especially curious from your perspective because I know back in the day when you started working on Saya, Bitcoin was the only other blockchain available out there, and you were thinking about how to do data storage on Bitcoin, and then you came up with the solution of Saya because it wasn't feasible. Um, what are your thoughts with Web5? Being built on Bitcoin. What does it mean?
Yeah, so I think that you cannot build what we built at Skynet on Bitcoin, and so the I'm not super familiar with the spec yet. It's still pretty new. I haven't like talked to any of the Web5 developers to get like a really deep dive on it. But from what if you're going to be using Bitcoin, you're going to be very heavily opinionated about Bitcoin must be, the payment mechanism. I don't think you can wrap that with security. So you're gonna end up trusting I believe they're called DWN, which is decentralized web node. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's a decentralized web node. It seems like most users are going to end up paying providers. They're not going to have any guarantees that hold those providers accountable. And so yeah, not a huge fan of the choice to be Bitcoin purist, and increasingly, I think Bitcoin purism is a mistake.
Yeah, and I think another component that I just briefly glanced was the identity layer that they're talking about is essentially going to be built as a layer two on Bitcoin, the DID network. Again, not sure what that means, but that's kind of the connection that they're making with Web5 and Bitcoin. Alex, did you have any thoughts on like the
Yeah,
identity component?
yeah. I just wanted to add, It'll be cool to hear the team and project release more information and hear them discuss it tomorrow. But um, my interpretation so far is their use of Bitcoin's largely for that identity piece. So having a way to anchor identity into a blockchain so that you can use it for that. And but besides that, a lot of the functionality they're providing isn't really tied to Bitcoin. It's more oriented around modular, shareable data and primitives for that. And I think that anchoring for the DIDs could probably occur on another chain. I'm not sure if they're committed to Bitcoin or not, but it seems like it's a modular component that isn't super tied to Bitcoin. We'll see.
Yeah, that's interesting. David, do you want to contrast, the identity components that we built at Skynet with MySky with some of these DID based identity layers?
Yeah. So I gotta admit, I've taken a look at the DID stuff like maybe 5 or 6 times, and it always just overwhelms me almost. It feels very like heavy and very like specified. I would say it's like over specified. And when you look at a DID identifier, it's just like I don't know. It looks like a big mess, and it's not very human friendly and not very human readable. But I also, especially over the past 6 months, I've really come to realize that decentralized identity is so much more than like just a means of authenticating, and a means of identifying. When we talk about decentralized identity, what we're normally talking about is our entire online presence. And so one thing that we've been doing at Skynet that I think is going to be a big element in turning from Web 2 to Web 5, the future, um, is treating identity as the collection of all of your data. So it's your username, it's your profile picture, it's all of your friends, it's all the blog posts you've made, all the tweets you've made, every video you've liked on YouTube, etc. Like all those things are part of your identity. And I don't feel like the DID spec um, grasps that very well. I feel like, especially DID, I feel like it's a bunch of theoretical structure about if you want to solve all these problems at once, this is the best way to do it, and it feels very like inflexible and not tailored to the actual real world, which is like a giant mess, and everyone's cutting corners all the time. And when I look at like the DIDs and the schemas of like ceramic and now Web5, I feel very restricted, and I feel like I can't just build things. I feel like I have to take some time to learn a lot. I have to structure my application to fit these like very narrow data types. And so yeah, I'm not a fan of that design style, and so at Skynet we've tried to structure things so that you can be a lot messier and a lot looser, and instead of using like schemas, we use APIs, and so you don't need to specify exactly how the data is formatted. Like on the back end, you just have a function that people can call. So I'll stop there. I'm definitely curious what Alex has to say about it.
Yeah, I think I need to do more research on the DIDs as well because, as you say, ceramic and all these projects are standardizing on them. But I think something you just said is interesting, an interesting point to touch on. Um, the Web5 material seemed to really focus on schemas and sharing of data around schemas. Um, and you mentioned Skynet focuses on APIs versus schemas, and that might be a good way to sort of so the schema sharing examples they show in the documentation, they seem like the holy grail for the web because they're just sharing your playlist from across one app to another app, and in practice that's probably a lot harder because of um, aligning on schema can be very difficult. But with Skynet, I think kind of focusing on these APIs that abstract away the schema and encode domain specific semantics and include methods that can be versioned and updated behind the scenes. I think that approach might be a little bit better than just aligning on trying to align every single application out there on schemas. Also, the distributed web nodes that they present, I think they just only have generic ways to share to save data, whereas having these modular Skynet style APIs kind of lets you encode actual semantics into the functionality.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why we did it this way. And so for people who are unfamiliar with how data sharing works on Skynet, and when I say data sharing, I mean both sharing data between two applications that are like private to the user, and also sharing data between multiple users. They both kind of happen in a similar way, but basically you have this thing called a module, which is a piece of code that runs client side that serves an API, And so you can call something like get profile, and then it will return, your profile image, or you can call something like get tweets, and it'll return the list of all the tweets that you have made. And what's nice about doing it like an API and passing around effectively JSON objects as responses is that if you don't like the way something is implemented, or if you want to add features, you want to add data, your only constraint is that you have to have this piece of code be able to serve a compatible API in the future. And so if you want to add something, you can either add a field that everyone else, like legacy callers are going to ignore the new field, or if you really need to like break something, you just add a new function. And so now you have the old function and the new function, and whatever data you need in the middle, you can structure that however you want so that you can serve both functions. And so when application developers are trying to work with each other's data, um, they don't have to coordinate so heavily. When you're in the schema world and you're doing something like passing around a music playlist, it's really important that every single music player in the entire ecosystem has the exact same way of handling music and presenting music and interacting with playlists. And so that's what I mean by like very like suffocating and restricting, is that if there's a music playlist schema and you want to make a music player, it's very difficult to in the schema world, it's very difficult to do something innovative or crazy or unique to make your application better, because if you do that, you're just going to completely break compatibility with all the data that users have onboarded. But in the API world, when you're using DAX on Skynet, you can do crazy things. And even though you're doing crazy things, because the data structures aren't what's important is the APIs, you just have a lot more flexibility to be doing completely different things than every other developer out there and still get access to all the data the users are uploading to applications that are not your own.
Yeah, I'm curious where with just the schemas and then the DWN nodes that save, I think the two data structures I've seen referenced are collections and threads. They seem convinced you can build a lot with those sort of generic building blocks, and I'm excited to see what people do build. Is if people can build with that'd be great. But I wonder like where the logic for things like if you had a playlist and you wanted to applications to append to that playlist in a certain way or insert items in a certain way, like at what part of the stack does that logic sit if the nodes are generic, um, and the way data is saved is generic, with only schema. So with APIs, you can put that logic in behind the API and protect the data. Um, so I'm curious to see where in this Web5 system that logic will sit.
Yeah. Seems like, Eric, I tweeted Eric Street, who's the CTO at Firefox, had similar concerns and skepticism, excuse me, around schemas and its ability to essentially have this open data model that is interoperable and can enable rich applications. I do want us to go, we spoke a lot about identity and open data and data interoperability. I want to go a level deeper on just the data storage component, which is web events. If you talk a little bit about what DWNs mean in the Web5 context, just based on what we've seen so far, would love to hear just how Skynet portals are structured and the differences in how managing decentralized data storage versus this concept of decentralized web nodes.
Sure, I can go first. So I think that the two like major questions for me around DWNs is one which I think is really important is how do users migrate data between DWNs? So if you set up a cluster of like 5 DWNs, who owns them? How much are you trusting them? And then if you have to switch to a different set of 5, how painful is that transition? And I think that that's a very important question for understanding how decentralized versus federated the system is. And so the Web5 team asserts that their DWN design is decentralized, which I think it plausibly is based on what I've read. I think I might tag it as decentralized as opposed to federated. But I think it really comes down to how easy is the user able to escape. And then just for some extra context for the audience, when I think about decentralized versus federated, it's normally a function of what happens if an entity withdraws. And so I like to use email as like the canonical federated system. So a lot of people think of email as decentralized. It's actually a federated system, and what makes email federated is that if a provider disappears, like let's say Hotmail disappears or AOL disappears, they take a huge chunk of the user base of email with them. And so when one provider, so a centralized system, when one provider shuts down, the whole party stops. In a federated system, when one party shuts down, a group goes down with them. And so it's federated because it doesn't take everyone down, but it does take down a chunk of users. And in a decentralized system, if a major provider goes down, you actually don't lose any users. The users that were dependent on that system will migrate to other providers and will retain full access. So um, yeah, DWNs, it seems plausible based on what I've read that they're decentralized and that there is a seamless transition between uh, providers if there's turbulence, but I think it remains to be seen. I don't know that I've read the full specification there. Um, and then of course, on Skynet, it is fully decentralized. There are repair mechanisms, and we've worked very hard to make sure that users are never dependent on any particular provider, and that as the network evolves and players come in and go out, a user's data is going to survive all the turbulence and carry over.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a user could definitely move their data from one DWN to another, and I've read that remotes don't have private keys and signing control and those types of things. But as you say, I wonder if a user shut off their one or two remote nodes, whether that day someone could access their information from another node. And I think that depends on how the data is replicated underneath. But I would assume that unless something was proactively replicated on IPFS underneath, the data might not be accessible if one remote node just went down. Um, so that might be where the benefit of an incentivized layer underneath that kind of distributes the data right away to a network versus storing it on just the one remote node. So it's unclear. It may have mechanics for doing that, but I think that's a nice decentralization test as well. If you shut off your one node, can the data be accessed immediately after from other nodes?
And yeah, that is an interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about Skynet. If you upload data to a portal and then you turn your computer off, and then the portal turns itself off and goes offline, your data is still accessible on Skynet, and the data is like fully replicated within usually like 5 to 10 seconds. So as long as the portal stays online for 5 seconds after you upload a file, when it shuts down, that file is out there and everyone can access it. And so that's uh, one really cool feature about Skynet. So another thing that I remember reading for DWNs is that it seems like they are trusted for authentication. So it seems like the Web5 specification is conscious of the idea that they don't want just anybody reading your private files. But it seems like they've chosen to solve that problem by trusting your DWNs not to uh, give data out to unauthorized parties, which um, I definitely don't like. I think that you should treat your service providers as like openly hostile towards you, because in the worst case they will be openly hostile towards you, and you want to be protected. And so on Skynet, we use encryption and obfuscation to make sure that your private files can't be connected to you, they can't be connected to each other, and they're also all encrypted. So even if someone were to find a blob, right, that blob is not connected to any person, it's not connected to any other blobs in the they're all the files are just kind of in one big puddle, and you can't tell one from the other, and you can't decrypt them. And so I don't see any reason why Web5 couldn't use this model. So maybe as the spec continues to evolve, they will be able to transition. I don't think that their current decision to use DWNs to manage authorization is actually a requirement of their architecture. I think they can work around it and solve that point of trust. But at least at the moment, it seems like they do have trust there.
Yeah, I'm curious about the necessity of those DWNs. I have read that they definitely do not have your private keys, but they are checking requests and filtering out requests that are not authorized. And it seems like it's a protection against bad actors that may want to collect and stash all the encrypted data for uh, later use. But again, I wonder if with a design like on Skynet SkyFS, like a encrypted file system, I don't think it's easy to go and collect all those encrypted blobs because you need to know the location, and the location information is also encrypted. I haven't thought through this fully yet, but I think you mentioned just now, David, I don't think something like Skynet's file system design is weak to that type of attack. So I'm really curious to continue to learn more about the DWNs and what exactly they do and what power they have to do on the network.
And maybe just worth addressing briefly. So again, I'm not 100% what corner of the world this was coming from, but there was discussion about yeah, if someone downloads your encrypted data, saves it for later when the encryption has been broken, and then can decrypt, a mass of data. Um, at this point in our cryptographic history, that seems rather unlikely. And again, it's hard to forecast what's going to happen in 40 years, but we need a lot of mathematical breakthroughs. From just my knowledge of the domain says that I would be very surprised if today's modern encryption were broken in 40 years. And that includes the advent of quantum computing. So quantum computing breaks a lot of cryptography. Encryption and hash functions are not part of the cryptography that breaks when you have quantum computers. So um, most of the privacy mechanisms, or all of the privacy mechanisms that protect you on Skynet, will survive all future attacks that we know are on the horizon, including quantum computers. The one thing that is kind of tricky is that signatures break, and so it becomes possible to forge signatures. So the entire Skynet registry, which is an important part of dynamic data, that will if you had a perfect quantum computer tomorrow, the owner of that computer could write any file to any dynamic piece of data, but they can't touch the immutable data. Immutable data is immune to quantum computing and quantum attacks.
I do want to bring people from the audience up. If you have questions, thoughts, comments on any of the things that we've discussed or not discussed yet. In the meanwhile, and feel free to request access to speak and we'll bring you up. In the meantime, I'm curious, what does all of this mean when we are talking about the end user? With Skype, with Portal, there are two options. You can run your own portals, or you can access the data, upload data using existing portals. And if one portal shuts down, there is another portal that you can still access your data. How does that look like in the DWM model? There more responsibility in the hands of users to make sure that their data exists. Any thoughts on just like what does this mean for the end user in the data storage context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely am not able to answer that for DWNs. I just don't know enough about how their ecosystem is architected. I don't know that they've thought as far at this point as to how does the, what is the exact user experience for user acquiring a set of DWNs to store their data. On Skynet, this is like a very front and center problem for us. We really want to make sure that data and applications are completely portal independent, and we also want to make sure that that's happening without the user having to like necessarily know what a portal is or spend time configuring it. We want a user to just get a seed and then be off to the races and automatically be using multiple portals and switching between them as needed. And so we're building something called the Skynet kernel, which has the ability to completely abstract away almost all interactions with the portal. The one exception is that at some point you got to pay for stuff, right? So if you're uploading 10 terabytes of data to Skynet, you do have to put money in at somewhere money has to go in. And so that's like the one point of friction. You need a seed, and then you have to insert money at some point at some storage volume. And then aside from that, everything else is abstracted. And so I'm curious if Web5 is going to be able to get to a similar place in terms of the user experience and setting up decentralized infrastructure for your Web5 data.
Yeah, I think the it sounds like the DWN may be something that a user relies on to keep the data available for their own requests or other users' requests for data that happens to be on that node. So maybe the difference is that it is between pinning data and paying for it, paying for someone to keep it healthy, and then the actual like availability of the data across the network. And maybe you need your own node more so if you have to do both of those things fully versus if you know that the data can be pulled down from many other nodes. It's more about just pinning the data and paying for a portal, than both of those things, taking control of both of those things on your own node. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I think I need to hear more about whether that's the case with the DWN, whether the user is really depending on it to keep all the data online and accessible.
For sure, a lot more digging and information needed to understand the Web5 architecture. I just realized I'm not a co host, so if people are requesting to speak, I would not be able to see that or approve it. So, Kaylee, if you're on this kind of handle, you would have to let people on stage.
Alex and I can probably do it too, I think.
Yeah. Again, we are in that stage of the Twitter spaces where we would love to hear from everyone who's joined us. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts on Web5 or Skynet, happy to take them right now. And David, Alex, let me know if we are seeing people. If not, happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, I don't see any hands. Looks like people are just chilling.
I guess, just taking another step back, we definitely did dive into the technical details. these are the components that we need to build truly decentralized applications, especially decentralized social applications. Identity, data storage, and then being able to build these applications. What's missing, David, according to you? Or just curious, where do you see the current state of Web3 to be, building these applications versus wait? Sorry, I got muted. Did you get the question?
Yeah, I think I lost the tail end of the question.
Just curious, these are kind of the building blocks that are needed for decentralized applications, decentralized social applications. Where, what do you think is the current state of Web3 to enable these applications versus waiting for something like Web5?
Yeah, I do think that we haven't yet seen like the killer Web3 application or Web5 application. I think there are a lot of like really good Sparks, and there are a lot of smaller applications with smaller user counts that are growing in Steam. Voop being one example. Just generic file sharing has really been taking off. And then you have Mirror on the other side of the ecosystem that's been doing well, and then even Audius has been doing pretty well. But um, yeah, it seems like there's still just more polish that needs to be in place. I don't know that it's any particular problem other than just you need more base infrastructure to get things moving. So I believe I was able to invite Cassidy up to speak. If you have a question, Cassidy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was just kind of curious when you plan for the kernel to kind of be ready for prime time, if you actually wanted to implement it in a production environment.
Yeah, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks. The browser extension's in a really good spot. All of the supporting libraries, libkernel and libmodule and libskynet are all in a good spot, and so the core kernel itself is basically the last big piece to polish up. It is working. There's a huge test suite. All the tests are passing, and all major functionality is working. And so, yeah, we're really close at this point. I know we're hoping to have a beta out in the next like 7 to 10 days, and then shortly after that, we don't plan on being in beta for very long. I think we'll be able to push it out further after not much time. So the kernel is very close at this point. I'd say under a month before it's like completely production ready.
Awesome, thanks. Excited to use it.
Any other questions from the audience? Or if there are topics, David, Alex, that we didn't get to yet, that you both wanted to bring up today?
I mean, there's like a general high. Oh, we have a question. I can answer that in a second. Welcome, Alec. Alec, I think you're a speaker now. If you can get your audio on.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so one of my biggest concerns about Skynet is that I'm afraid talent will see like, oh, anyone can copy my data, and make a better app than me, and then all of a sudden I don't have any users. Do you think that's a real concern, and what do you think about that in general?
Yeah, so I think it's a double-edged sword. It's the way Skynet is structured is much better for smaller players than it is for bigger players, relative to the current way that the internet is structured. And that's because today, if you're a smaller player, you don't just have to make a better application, you also have to get users on it and build an entire ecosystem around it. But in Skynet, all you have to do is make a better application because the ecosystem is there and you can just pull all the data in even without any users. You can have 0 users and, millions of videos on your video platform, because the Skynet data model is open. And so I think that that's a very good thing for innovation. I think the internet has kind of ground to a halt recently because the shots are basically 100% being called by Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and that's basically it. Every major website is under one of those four for the most part. You got Netflix, but um, and it's even if you have a good idea for how to improve YouTube, like good luck implementing that. Good luck getting it out into the world and getting adoption. Like you can make a better YouTube, but if it has no users, it's not going to be able to acquire users. And so I think that that's like the most valuable thing that Skynet does is make it so that smaller developers can be competitive with these, trillion-dollar giants because everyone's accessing the same pool of data. Um, but we've also tried to set up a monetization system, and this is a little bit further out, maybe 3 months out, definitely after the kernel, that will carry forward revenue to the major inventors of ideas and technologies, even if they get um, scooped by a team that executes better. And so Skynet's monetization has a credit feature where when you use a piece of code or when you use an idea, when you copy something from another platform, you actually credit that platform in your copy. And so if you take YouTube and you make it 35% better, you will still be giving 65% of the revenue back to the original creator. And so, um, it's going to be a bit of a social experiment. It's going to take some time to iron out, and really find what standards, like how do you measure that it's 35% better? Like that's kind of an open question, but I think that there are reasonable approaches that people can take. And again, the goal is to make it so that if you have a key idea that works really well and revolutionizes the space, even if, 2 years from now, absolutely nobody's running your code at all, because they're using your idea, you are still receiving revenue, from having an idea that revolutionized, whatever ecosystem the idea was supplementing.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm excited to see Skynet's solution and see how that plays out. But also, I think it's important to note, I think for any of these decentralized solutions with open data and forkable applications, I think that'll be a something we'll have to work through, and it'll just be hard for centralized entities to kind of capture all the value and hold it hostage, which is what we're going for. But again, yeah, as you mentioned, it creates this new problem.
So, I don't think it can be denied that a company owning the data is obviously more monetizable than data that's owned by the user. And I think that leads to those companies that own the data to have more profits and then be able to hire, basically steal the talent that may otherwise, want to work on user-owned products or products that have user-owned data, but it's just too good to have that money. And also, they can afford to they can afford to cut costs. You know what I mean? Like sell at a loss, or not sell at a loss. What's the way to put it? Basically undercut in a sense, and they'll have more. And in general, YouTube has a lot of advertising money coming in, and they can afford to pay their creators and keep them on the platform. So I'm just a little worried in that sense, where these companies have so much money and so much power that people will always prefer their platforms. And I guess it's kind of fear mongering, because I don't have any proof that we can't win and bring in talent that's just more altruistic in motivation. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to, like, do you want to be at a giant company where the ethics are unclear and the company in general is like not that good for the health of society, or do you want to be on the ground where you have more control, and pushing the space forward? And I think really, when I hear people analyze like business models and talk about projects and like what's going to be successful, I think people generally aren't worried about like the talent, and they aren't worried about uh, they aren't worried about feature competition. The two major things they tend to focus on, the big one is network effect. It's always like, how do you establish a network effect? How do you spin the flywheel up? And so the Skynet, we completely agree that these giants have like way too much power, and we think that the way to disassemble them is to make it so that the network effect is no longer a requirement to get a new application spinning up. And then the other thing that people talk about a lot is uh, the heavy marketing budgets that the giants have and how much control they have over the media. And like, Google literally controls what people search for. And so that's another like point of power that's challenging. And I don't know that we have a direct answer for that side, but we definitely found a solution for overcoming network effects, and that's something that I'm excited about. We have another question from Jason, who may have just withdrawn his request to speak.
Just to add a little bit to that, yeah, I think especially today, there's a lot of businesses that it would be hard. It's hard to imagine them just being transferred over to this model where they kind of give up their data right away. But I think the value comes from maybe grassroots efforts, starting simple, simple file transfers, sharing of social data, building up from simple things might be the right approach. And I think one of the critical things is making it easier to use than signing up for some centralized Google service and all that, which is fairly easy to use. I think one thing we have to do is make these things even easier and even more convenient to use. So if if it's easier to transfer your files over one of these networks, if it's easier to have a open RSS feed that can be consumed by a million different applications, if it's more convenient and simple and easy, then I think it can kind of build up from there. But yeah, if I were to imagine some regular business, I don't think they would just immediately today want to open up their data for everyone's consumption.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just want to say I really do believe that on a fundamental level, the use in the decentralized world is superior to the user experience in the centralized world. And it's difficult to see that now because we're still working through all.
Wait,
Sorry.
David, we lost you there. Yeah, if you wanted to repeat.
Anyway, yeah, so at a fundamental level, I believe that decentralized user experience can be superior to centralized user experience, because decentralized user experience can ensure that if you want to leave Facebook, you can still talk to your grandmother. You can switch to the app that you prefer. You don't have to, get shoehorned into, like, for example, Reddit pushing everyone onto the mobile app. That's something that in a decentralized world just doesn't happen. And I think, you know, you can have files on every single system at once. You can have, in a decentralized world, it's much easier to unify DMs across all platforms. So right now you have like 90 different places that you message people. In a decentralized world, it's easy to, if each of those messaging systems have their own API, it's a lot easier to, make one central place or have all the messages shared between all the platforms. And so there are all these like corners that I bump into in the centralized world where it's like, oh, if this were decentralized, this user experience hurdle wouldn't have to be here. And so I do think we'll get there, and that decentralized things will be much easier and like more fun than centralized things.
So I think the only issue with that idea that all my messages from all the services in one place is that you won't ever have the centralized messages, will you? I mean, or do they provide APIs that let you pull those in? I'm actually not sure on that, but and another thing is, I think you could tackle. I think censorship is a good vector for adoption. A lot of censorship, people that worry about censorship, will want to join these decentralized platforms. But at the same time, I think that's probably a bad optics in the sense that, like look at Truth Social, right? I mean, there's like this idea of, okay, what kind of person uses Truth Social? Uh, and it makes other people just think, oh, I would never use that, so if you bring in the censorship aware crowd, there becomes this idea of, oh, that's just a platform for this type of person, for crazy ideas or ideas that this is just for people who, want a wild, wild west internet, and that's bad, misinformation and blah, blah, blah. So. Did you want me to wrap that up in a question? Basically, do you think the censorship vector for adoption is a good idea or a bad one, and why?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always a like worse way to message things and a better way to message things, but at a fundamental level, I think censorship is like super important, because like we're basically entering a world right now where the tech giants are calling the shots on what you are and are not allowed to talk about. And I don't know how many people remember, but in mid to late 2020, YouTube basically had an implicit ban on discussing the COVID virus, which it was just completely absurd. But that alone like highlights how important it is to have censorship resistance. It shouldn't be the case that a unelected trillion-dollar company can suffocate, 70% of the long form discourse on an important topic just by saying, if you discuss this topic, we'll ban you from our platform. But that's how much power Google has, and they do use their censorship powers to shape what we think about. And I think that that's extremely important to address, and has nothing to do with wild crazy ideas. It's not crazy to talk about COVID. And I think this happens in many other places, just these soft bits of censorship, that really have a broader chilling effect on society, and that we need to get around. So I do think that when messaged correctly, the censorship resistant piece is a very powerful message that people resonate with. You just have to focus on the ways that people are being censored that are familiar to them, and that they agree they wish they had more freedom. We also brought Red Solver up, if Red Solver had a question or comment.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. So on the censorship aspect, personally, I think that many users just have or many users and content creators, their main concern is being completely. I don't know if deplatformed is the right word, but for example, if you're like a musician and you're producing music, or if you're like streaming on or posting videos on YouTube and this is your main source of income, then it's really, really bad that the company can just easily decide to ban you forever. So I think the key point is not to maybe advertise like that the content itself is censorship resistant, but that the identity is really owned by you, that the social graph can't be taken away from you. So if you're following someone, you're really following this person, and nobody can take it away from you. And also your identity only is owned by you, so no single company can decide to just block it. For example, with a Google account that can easily be deleted, and then you lose access to a ton of different stuff in your life, which happens quite a lot. And I think users are more aware of this specifically than than maybe their content being censored.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the user-owned identity and data kind of just provides this ability to leapfrog over that issue. In addition to the other part that I think is huge is besides censorship, just leapfrogging to a new technological platform where it's more creative and there isn't just three news sources. There's tons of different curators that exist and people can kind of remix and configure their experiences and subscribe to different data sources. And when you have an open platform more like that, you can kind of build your own interpretation of the web and how you consume information, and it kind of just leapfrogs the issue entirely through kind of technical advancements.
I do think this idea that YouTube owns your identity, or Google, I mean, and owns your audience and can take it away at any time. I think, yeah, clearly creators see that and think it's bad. But if the only option is, okay, now go to this decentralized platform and start all over again, I guess it's better to do that proactively and then be able to reach your audience and say, hey, I'm over here, you should follow me here. And that might be a great way to build up Skynet usage, as long as people aren't resistant to the idea that I have to pay money to set up an account to follow you. Is that a requirement, or am I misunderstanding?
No, it's not.
So that's just when you start hosting your own data.
Not even then, because if you only have light usage, then usually free portals cover your costs.
Yeah, so the expenses typically, I think of it kind of like an ISP, where ISPs don't have a free tier, but we have a free tier, and you get to use Skynet up to some certain point for free. And actually, Google Fiber did this. So when Google Fiber rolled out, anyone in the neighborhood could get free internet. And then if you wanted to go faster, you could pay $5 a month, and if you wanted to go really
Happy to continue the conversation, but I also want to be mindful to be an hour. David, Alex, did you want to continue the conversation, or do we want to wrap this up?
I'm ready to wrap it up.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. This is not a one and done conversation. There's a um, lot of things that we can dig into specific to Skynet, and also as things are developing with Web5. But appreciate everyone joining. I would recommend following us on Twitter, and we would probably do more of these conversations. But in the meantime, feel free to tag us, um, comment, ask questions on our Twitter. We are actively responding to them. But really appreciate everyone joining, and thank you, David and Alex, for sharing your thoughts today on Web5. There is a whole conversation happening around Web5 with the official team tomorrow. So if people are interested, feel free to jump into that conversation. But really, again, appreciate everyone joining, and thank you, David and Alex.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one, everyone. Bye.